Hello, I'm Neil McGregor, and on this download you're about to hear Germany, Memories of a Nation, from BBC Radio 4.
Near a forest, there lived a poor woodcutter and his wife and his 2 children. The boy's name was Hansel, and the girl's Gretel.
Rapunzel was the most beautiful child in the world. When she was 12 years old, the witch shut her up in a tower in the midst of a wood.
At last, the queen sent for a huntsman and said, "Take Snow White out into the woods so that I may set eyes on her no more. You must put her to death and bring me her heart for a token."
Most of us know these stories. Many of us indeed still have our childhood copies. Hansel and Gretel, Rapunzel, Snow White. The characters in the fairy tales of the brothers Grimm are part of our childhood. What befalls them, the accidents, the adventures, we remember with fondness and a shiver on the way to the happy ending. But they all share one characteristic. The action is firmly set in the woods, dark and forbidding. That is where character is demonstrated, virtue and ingenuity prevail, and evil is overcome. These fairy tales tell the fate of imaginary figures, but they're also in a very real sense about the destiny of Germany itself. And one of the great traditions or myths of Germany is that its origins and destiny were forged, like Hansel and Gretel's, in the forest. The Teutoburg forest, the Teutoburger Wald, about 60 miles northeast of Cologne, is the archetypal German forest. There are conifers, beeches and oaks. It's immense, and if you lose your way, you might never be seen again. In 9 AD, the Teutoburg forest was the site of the great German victory over Rome. A massive Roman army had invaded, intent on conquering and colonizing Germany east of the Rhine. The warrior Hermann, leading an alliance of many different German tribes, mounted a dazzlingly successful ambush and wiped the Romans out.
Zum Kampf, zum Kampf, zum heiligen Kampf.
The forest remained in German hands. The Rhine became the frontier of the Roman Empire, and the rest of Germany remained free and unconquered. It was in the Teutoburg forest, so the national legend runs, that the nation was born, out of valiant, ingenious resistance to Roman aggression and occupation. Jumping forward to the early 1800s, both of this programme's objects are still closely linked to the forest, and both are trying to create a sense of Germanness as a response to a similar aggression. In the first decade of the 19th century, the aggressors were not the Romans, but their Gaulish successors, the French, under Napoleon. And this time, the French had not only attacked the Germans, they had conquered them. Napoleon had dismantled the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation and occupied their homeland, from the Rhine to the Russian border. Our first object is a book still found in almost every German home. It is the Kinder- und Hausmärchen, children's and household tales, traditional stories told by Germans of all sorts to their children, gathered and studied by Jakob and Wilhelm Grimm. The Grimm brothers collected these folk tales all their lives. They believed that the essence of a people lies in the stories that they tell their children, and they produced many editions of their book. The first appeared in 1812, just as the military resistance to Napoleon was gathering strength. But the Grimms were not interested in these just as children's stories. Their real obsession was the one thing that all Germans shared, and had always shared, their language. Stefan Martus from Berlin's Humboldt University has published extensively on the Grimm's research into German language. What's so interesting about them, he told me, is that they were trying to discover what could be described as German, but doing so in an international context. They realized that a language, although part of a wide family, operates according to its own internal laws, and that those laws are not influenced by outside forces, that a language is an autonomous, living organism. Stefan Martus also felt that this concept had a political significance. that just as a language has its own internal form and logic, so do societies and communities. Laws cannot be imposed from outside. So for the Grimms, political, social and linguistic history are interchangeable. In German society, changes will be effective only if they come from within, in harmony with the German way of doing things, and not by foreign imposition. In other words, the Grimm's fairy tales were an integral part of a German political and social renaissance, evidence that in their language and their folk tales, the Germans had an identity which no foreign invader could eradicate or appropriate. By 1812, France had conquered and occupied all of Germany. Cologne was a city in France. But the brothers Grimm saw that Germany had something that the French could not claim, an unbroken line in her language, reaching back to the mists of prehistory. And this, according to Will Vaughan, Professor of Art History at Birkbeck College in London, is what lay behind their fascination with the study of language.
I think this idea that Germans had kept their original language was very important, that somehow the German language was expressive of the whole German character and psyche and background, because it had been the language that Germans had always spoken. And one of the things that Grimm said, well, after all, what have we in common but our language? And one of the things you find in the Napoleonic time is that there was a lot of comparing between French and German. It was claimed that the French had not kept their original language. The French were now speaking a version of Latin. So there wasn't this visceral connection between the French and their language that there was between the Germans and their language.
Our second object in this programme is a painting, a work by the great Romantic artist Caspar David Friedrich, Der einsame Baum, the solitary tree, painted in 1822 and now hanging here in the National Gallery in Berlin. Behind a village whose spires and roofs we can see is a mountain range, but in the middle of the painting, totally dominating the composition, is a lone oak tree. Its upper part is battered and damaged. Its lower branches are in full leaf, and they give shelter to a shepherd and his flock gathered beneath them. Will Vaughan has studied the significance of this painting for German national consciousness.
Oak is right at the root of the sort of imagery of Germany as a people who had survived all sorts of hardship. It goes right back to the story of Hermann or Arminius, who had defeated the Romans in the Teutoburg forest. It was almost as though the forest was on the side of the Germans because they'd set an ambush up for them, hiding behind the trees. And it's very striking that when you see the freedom fighters of the wars of liberation, they also went around in the forest waiting for some French to come and all the rest of it. So I think anyone in those days would have immediately been able to feel a national identity with the oak.
The oak tree was an image taken up by Germany's rulers on more than one occasion as an emblem of survival and rebirth. Oak leaves on the Iron Cross in 1813, for instance, and on Germany's first post-1945 coins. Here, Friedrich's lonely oak, battered but still standing, offers shelter and nourishment in the early morning light to the shepherd and his sheep. It has weathered the storm. Like Germany, it has survived. Friedrich spent his life painting wild, sublime landscapes in which both the individual and the nation can discover their potential. Will Vaughan again.
Friedrich still remains a very important artist in Germany because he represented the German soul and landscape. And I think one of the things about Friedrich is the fact that because he is a painter of the inner world as well as the outer world, it's not just the literal terrain, the physique of the landscape that's being shown you. It's, so to speak, the landscape perceived through a German soul. So it has that emotive charge to it.
In Friedrich's paintings, the trees are sublime. In the Grimm's fairy tales, the forest is threatening. Both are editing the German landscape for their own purposes. But as Stefan Martus tells us, they're doing more than that. They are inventing the German landscape. For Stefan Martus, today's German forests are just as much an invention of Romanticism as were the fairy tales. the fictional backdrop of the children's stories was made a reality by the reforestation of the later 19th century.
Auch von dem Setting her, von den Märchen, also von den Wäldern und so weiter, ängstigt man die Kinder.
What happens in the forest in their fairy tales is often quite dreadful, quite cruel, and this is intended to frighten children so that at the end of the tale they can be calmed and comforted by their mother's voice.
Wird eine Art Grundsicherheit vermittelt.
Good and evil faced each other off in the fairy tales. The children raged against the evil witch, the wicked stepmother pretending to be kind. But always, waiting at the end of the storytelling, is the bürgerliche Mutti, the bourgeois German mother, with her comforting words. Solid German virtues encoded in the DNA of the language, the stories, and the people themselves will prevail.
In der ersten Fassung ist es so, dass die Mutter...
Stefan Marters argues that, as the editions went on, there was an increasingly moralistic element in the fairy tales, driven by the growing middle class in 19th century Germany. So while early versions of the fairy tales often had mothers as the evil women, as with Snow White, for example, later editions turned them into stepmothers. You couldn't have a real mother being evil in a proper middle-class family.
Anderes, zumindest in Deutschland, berühmtes Märchen Rapunzel.
Take another famous story, Rapunzel. In the first edition of the tales, the evil fairy works out that Rapunzel must be having visits from men. How does she know? Rapunzel's clothes get too tight. She's pregnant.
Weil Rapunzel die Kleider zu eng werden.
In later editions, Wilhelm Grimm deletes this whole section from the story and makes Rapunzel contradict herself to the fairy, which is how she realises men must have been visiting her. She's been desexualised and made respectable. These are Victorian values, German style, which is one reason the stories so appealed to the British as well.
I think you can argue that the paintings of Caspar David Friedrich and the fairy tales of the brothers Grimm are essentially doing the same thing. They're re-establishing an identity for German-speaking people which had been dislocated when Napoleon destroyed the old Holy Roman Empire and the political structures that depended on it. They were offering one answer to the question, who are we now? And for many painters, writers and historians, part of that answer was the figure of the warrior Hermann.
Zum Kampf, zum heiligen Kampf.
Caspar David Friedrich painted a landscape tribute to the hero of the Teutoburg forest, an imaginary Hermann's grave in which he shows a few tiny figures contemplating the great German's tomb. Today, over 100,000 visitors a year come to admire the colossal statue of Hermann that stands in the Teutoburg forest. Begun after the Napoleonic Wars to mark the liberation of Germany, it was completed in 1875. Nearly 90 feet high, the bronze figure brandishes his sword, needless to say, in the direction of France. Most Germans today are embarrassed by its shrill aggression and nervous or ashamed of the later misappropriations of the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, first by the Prussians and then by the Nazis. But if the memory of Hermann is problematic, the Germans' attachment to the forest is still deep, a central part of the national character. Friedrich and the Grimms would, I think, be delighted to know that forest now covers a third of the country and is protected by law. The Greens have become more firmly established as a political party in Germany than anywhere else in Europe. For details of more programmes about Germany available on the BBC, or to see the objects and buildings featured in this series, search online for Germany, Memories of a Nation. Of a Nation. Of a Nation. Of a Nation.